On Tuesday, it does help if I switch it on. There we are. Last Tuesday, or this Tuesday night, I went to a very different gathering, which was a fundraiser for the marriage equality campaign. And what really struck me coming in this morning to this gathering is what a large and diverse group of people have now in various ways been swept up in what we currently call the LGBTIQ whatever movement. I have to say that on Tuesday, in the very ritzy surroundings of Crown Towers, I felt both old and short. And luckily, I feel less of both of those being here with you. But of course, what strikes me, and what struck me so forcibly being in that room on Tuesday, was thinking about the extraordinary changes that have taken place basically over the last half century in how we understand the position of people who are sexually and gender diverse. And I think that one of the things that I'm very conscious of is that my generation, which is a generation represented by many people in this room, grew up reading everything we could find about the experience of being other, whether we were othered by our sexuality or our gender, or indeed by ability or by race or by ethnicity. And I really regret the way in which I think we have lost, as a community, the ability to read widely. And I'm aware that I'm talking to a lot of people who work in service organisations. My experience is that people who work often in service organisations are so overwhelmed with official reports and bureaucratic references and the need to produce certain sorts of very narrow, academically based journal articles that they've actually lost the ability to read widely, and particularly to read fiction. And one of the things that I think our generation can actually impart to much younger people is the importance of understanding other people's experience. It is not enough just to speak of our own experience, because our own experience is partial and does not provide an analysis of why we have experienced certain things. And the lost art, I think, and it is a lost art, of reading fiction widely is, I think, something that we can bring. And I actually want to put in a plug, because of course a conference and one's allowed to plug products. I'm not plugging myself. I'm plugging our wonderful community bookshop, Hares and Hyenas. And any of you who are visiting from interstate, I'd really suggest you go down Johnson Street, Collingwood, and have a look at Hares and Hyenas. Thanks, Jamie. But I do, of course, want to also recognise that my generation, who are basically people now in retirement, are people who grew up in a period when being homosexual was to be criminalised, to be defined as ill, as sinful, as in need of prison, church, and psychiatry. And the scars that that's left are very real. And so when people engage with people who whose formative experiences come out of that period, it's, I think, necessary to sometimes recognise that wounds can go very deep, and people will not necessarily acknowledge the scars that they're carrying, partly because to defend ourselves, we have to cover up the scars. But they're real, and I think what is significant is that they are different and shared. The experience of someone who is trans, the experience of someone who's lesbian, the experience of a gay man are common in some ways and very different in others. And thinking about what I might talk about today, I was actually trying to think about how one might illustrate both those commonalities and those differences. And I'm very struck by the fact that when I started to be aware of my sexuality, and when actually because I'm a Leo. Leos, as we know, are egotists. There are no other star signs if you're a Leo. There's Leo, and then we know there are 11 others. We don't know what they are. But I was sort of outed. I outed myself publicly quite young. At that time, probably the dominant image of homosexuality in Australia would have been the drag queens performing at venues at King's Cross that were essentially aimed at titillating straight audiences. And I think it's important to recognise the complexity of sexual attitudes to sex and gender that particular image, which is a very strong image in Australian culture, been reinforced by things like the film Priscilla, the musical Priscilla, the book Priscilla, God knows what tea towel Priscillas, and to think what impact that has had on generations of people trying to make sense of how the way they felt about their bodies, the way they felt about their sexual desires, the way they felt about who they might fall in love with are defined in a larger world. And of course, many of us in this room lived through the early days of the gay movement, when gay was understood to include both women and men. Probably everyone in this room lived through the early days of the AIDS epidemic, when a whole generation of people who were our age, to whom we were close, died. And thinking about the different experiences of women and men, it strikes me that the very different impact of that epidemic is something we're not sufficiently willing to talk about. We recognise that many women, particularly many lesbians, played an extremely important role in the response to the AIDS epidemic. And I'm deliberately saying AIDS rather than HIV because that was the term we used in the 1980s. But the reality is that for all gay men of a certain age, there is a hollow. There is a missing generation of people who should have grown old along with us. And I was reflecting on this at the break with David. The reality is we're now at a point when we would have already expected, having reached post-retirement age, that our peers would start to die. But nothing had prepared us for the idea that in our 20s and 30s, our peers and our friends and our lovers would die. And I think it's important to recognise just how defining an experience that is, both for our generation, but also for younger men particularly, who started coming to terms with their sexuality in the period of the Grim Reaper. And except for the non-Australians in the audience, probably all remember the images of the Grim Reaper and the bowling ball coming down the alley, ironically knocking over almost everybody except the gay men. The Grim Reaper was great advertising and very bad epidemiology. But I've been struck by a couple of men I've known over the last few years in their early 40s, whose whole sense of sexuality and attitude to sexuality and fears about themselves are very much conditioned by having been teenagers, having had to deal with those images of the early epidemic. And I think it's interesting to reflect, therefore, on some of the key differences in the ways in which homosexual women and men come to terms with their sexuality. And I think this becomes very relevant, or at least remains very relevant as people age. Because as we age, we of course carry with us stories, histories, friends, maybe even enemies that go back decades. And I think that there are a couple of very striking things. I'm always very uncomfortable about the B in the LGBTIQ alphabet. I'm very uncomfortable about it because I basically believe that everybody is potentially bisexual. And if everybody is potentially bisexual, then I'm not quite sure why we need to identify the B. But the real point I want to make is that it seems from all the available evidence, women are much more likely than men to acknowledge potential bisexuality. And I think that that is something we have not been willing enough to discuss. But it goes hand in hand with the other point that I'd want to make, which is that the sexual experiences, by and large, of homosexual women and homosexual men are rather different. Men get socialised into a world, a fairly large commercial and social world, in which casual sex is taken for granted. I think we all know that heterosexual dating sites like Tinder took the model from sites like Grindr. We invented casual sex. And we ought to be proud of the fact we invented casual sex rather than be slightly apologetic and feel, as some people now in the marriage movement feel, we have to pretend we actually believe in lifelong monogamy. We can believe in it. It doesn't mean we have to practice it. And that is, after all, the basis of most functioning Christians. But I do remember this wonderful story from the early 70s when one of the early gay liberationists in Melbourne, the wonderful film critic Barbara Creed, tells the story of a group of women in Melbourne Gay Lib were very jealous of the fact that men could meet each other for casual sex at beats. Now, I assume most of you know that beats are basically places often around or in public toilets where casual sex takes place. And so a number of women organised a picnic in the Edinburgh Gardens. The problem was they started talking to each other. They started sharing sandwiches, and everybody went home alone. And I tell this story with actually a serious purpose, which is let's encourage a much more open discussion of the different sexual experiences that we all bring as we get older, and that we share in many ways with today's generation. Because one of the things that strikes me, and I now can really only speak about gay men, or homosexual men, because I think there's an important distinction. So I'm talking now about men who have sex with men, to use the AIDS acronym. There is, on one hand, a mythology that before the epidemic, there was this golden age. If we were in Sydney, I could actually date and place the golden age along Oxford Street, which probably most of you know has now become fairly tawdry and deserted. But there was this period which I think is thought of as the Golden Age. In fact, there's a book written called The Golden Age of Promiscuity. I don't think much has changed. The way we talk about it has changed, and the possibilities for long-term relationships as more and more people are open about their sexuality has certainly changed. But I think that there still remain fundamental ways in which people, when they come into a queer world, and I'm now using a term that I think embraces a much wider range of sexual and gender diversity, I think there are ways in which we still are socialised into and understand sexual possibilities rather differently. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, because people's sexuality, their desires, their needs, what arouses them, do not suddenly shut down because you get your last paycheck. And I think that's a discussion, again, and I hope is taking place in some of the halls. But I guess I want to make a couple of points about where we are at the moment, because I think that the current marriage debate has become a quite extraordinary moment in Australian history. In a sense, Tony Abbott is totally right. It is not just an argument about marriage. It is clearly now an argument about acceptance, about recognition that there is a range of sexualities and gender expressions in our society, and that we should welcome that. And for those people who feel it's tough, and I'm sure there are people in this room who've had very difficult and painful conversations with family, who have come up against homophobic bigotry, who have been reduced, and I've held people in tears at what's going on. I think it's really important for us to remember that at no point in our history have we had so many supporters. In fact, the problem for the marriage movement is we have too many supporters. They're fighting. One of the lovely aspects of every marriage rally for the last few years is the battle between leaders of Labor and Greens to be up there on the platform. And this is good. You know, those of us who remember the 1970s, we certainly didn't envisage the alternative Prime Minister of Australia fighting to be defending us. The really interesting thing, I think, about the No case is how difficult it is for them to find plausible celebrities to back them up. And I think we ought to take that as a moment of affirmation. And to people who do feel this is tough, who do feel upset, just point them to the huge amount of support that is coming out. And I'm very reminded, when I use the term coming out, of the story of my then 17-year-old nephew, who was actually the nephew of my now dead partner, but whose family I'm now part of. Peter came out while he was still at school on Facebook. And his mother rang Anthony to tell him that Peter, whom we sort of figured, we picked Peter from about the age of 3 on. And I know this is terrible stereotyping. I would object to it if anybody except me were doing it, okay. Peter came out on Facebook. Anthony's sister rang at literally the moment that on the television screen, Kurt, in Glee, was coming out to his father. And I love that story because it actually reminds us that what has really changed are the images and the possibilities that kids now see that we couldn't see. We didn't have that. Some of you, like me, might remember the gasps of horror in the movie theatres if 2 men or 2 women ever kissed. And you will also remember that pretty well invariably, if there were 2 women or 2 men, one of them at least had to die tragically at the end, so we were in no doubt that this was a really bad way to live your life. Things have changed, and I think it's important we recognise that. And I also want to point to what I think is a problem. I think there are 2 real problems connected with the current marriage debate that are worth thinking about. One is the huge waste of resources. And I'm not so worried about the 120 million that everyone keeps talking about. Yes, it's an expensive, ridiculous farce. We know that. But I don't think it's a good argument to say we shouldn't spend money on a political process. What I think really bothers me is not the 120 million government money, it's the huge amount of emotional, financial, human resources in our community that has had to go into fighting a battle that actually shouldn't have been required. And my great hope is that it won't stop there. I mean, it's terrific that Qantas is supporting marriage equality. It's wonderful that the man who has the highest corporate salary in Australia is giving away a reasonably small fraction of that salary to marriage equality. In fact, sometimes one needs to look at the percentage of people's giving rather than be too impressed by the amount. But will that money still be there after November the 15th? And will it go to groups, to people, to movements, to issues that really affect those people who are most marginalised? And that links to my second concern about the marriage debate. And I'm talking here within an audience of people I regard as comrades, and I would assume who are totally on side. I suspect the number of no votes in this hall is reasonably small. But I get worried by the way in which, inevitably, the argument for marriage leads to marriage being portrayed as the only possible way for human happiness and a fulfilling life. Now, I speak as someone who was in a very long-term relationship. My partner died over 4 years ago from lung cancer. And I understand what it is like to be... I now understand all those women in black whom I used to see driving through the northern suburbs of Melbourne. There is a reality about losing a life partner. But I'm much more concerned about those people who haven't been able, or may not have wanted to, establish a long-term relationship with one other person, and the way in which the marriage debate consistently reinforces the idea that somehow they've failed. And I think it's incumbent upon us, and I'm very aware that people in this room are working with a lot of people who have to deal with ongoing traumas in their life. I think it's very important that we remind people that, and in fact the previous images of the community centres in Massachusetts, the meals, the homes, all those remind us that one of the things our movement tried to do was to establish alternative forms of family, alternative versions of community. And I worry that we've forgotten about that in our eagerness to put everybody in matching white tuxedos and march them in single, or in double file, I guess, up the aisle of the nearest convenient church. And I think that is a really important lesson for us to think about, particularly because those of you working in an aged care sector are going to find more and more people like me who've lost their partners, and I suspect more and more people who, for all sorts of reasons, have gone through life without a partner and with our children. And if you think about it, the way in which our mainstream media depicts old age, I know we're not allowed to say old age, but believe me, it is. The way in which old age is depicted, somehow there's always the caring kids. You know, there are always these stories about, I had to put my mother into a home. But what if there is no kid? What if there is no partner? And I think that, to me, is the great challenge. But I want to end on an affirmative note. I think that one of the differences between people today in their 20s and those of us who were part of the first thrust of a gay liberation movement 40 years ago, I think one of the crucial differences is there is much more willingness among young people today to talk across generational lines. I'm very struck. I know it was pointed out to me, and I said this before, that I'm talking about a small group of people, but I have a certain amount to do with the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives, which are headquartered in Melbourne, and I'm very struck by the eagerness, the enthusiasm of very much younger people to come and research and hear and listen to the stories of previous generations. Well, I think that the thing that really impresses me is we've lived through a whole lot of very difficult and traumatic times. And everybody in this room, I'm sure, carries with them war stories of engagement with issues that have been difficult, controversial, personal, hurtful. What I hope we've learned from this is the real importance of being kind to each other and of recognising that people can disagree but be on the same side. And I have to say, I've had some remarkably good experiences of that recently with people leading the marriage equality movement who know that I've always been cynical about that as a goal, but I've been able to work with them in a campaign where clearly, as I say, I think it's much more about just changing the Marriage Act. But what's really struck me is the willingness of people to bring in those with whom they have disagreements. And at the same time, the other side of this, I have been struck by some of the nastiness, the venom, the bitterness, the anger that I've seen on some websites where people with very trivial differences arguing about a semantic, about the meaning of a term, about how we should describe someone, that can degenerate into the most vicious and brutal attacks on other people who are basically with us. So, as I say, I want to end. It's very easy in this room. And, you know, if I were a more religious person, I would say I feel the love, but I'm sorry, I need someone to be physically with me to feel the love. But were I more religious, were I more spiritual, I would say, yes, there is something rather wonderful about this gathering. And what I really want to do in ending is to say, this is amazing. This is not something I think when we were meeting in tiny rooms and organising little protests 40 years ago, we couldn't have imagined anything like this. And bringing all of you together, bringing people who are genuinely committed to working, to understanding, and yes, to loving, is, I think, a great achievement. So I want to thank the organisers and good luck to all of us.